Hello, welcome to the Go Crisis podcast with me, David Eads, and the CEO of Go Crisis, Marie Marais. This is, of course, the podcast where we tackle the challenges and experiences and learnings that come with dealing with disaster, crisis, catastrophe, all the way from response to recovery to communications to policy issues for individuals, but critically for businesses and for governments.
Our guest today is one of the foremost trauma surgeons in the United States, Rachael Calcutt. She's the Associate Dean of Data Science and Innovation for the UC Davis School of Medicine in Sacramento, California, one of the busiest trauma surgery centers in the US. She's the Trauma Medical Director there, very much an active practicing clinician, while also a lead figure in the field of artificial intelligence.
It's quite a CV, isn't it? She was also right at the heart of one of the most challenging responses any trauma unit could expect. The Asiana Airlines crash of 2013 in San Francisco. Nearly 200 passengers and crew required emergency treatment. We caught up with her at the unconscionably early hour of 0400 in California to discuss this often unheralded field of disaster response. And I asked her, first of all, to explain a little bit what a trauma surgeon actually does and what it was that took her down that path. Rachael, it is lovely to see you. You're joining us from where?
California.
California. Okay, well, I'm in the sunny southeast of England, as indeed is Marie. Look, first things first, apart from the fact we're delighted to have you, I'm still enough of an ignoramus to need some explanation about what a trauma surgeon actually is and does, and what on earth would drive you into what many of us would see as a rather morbid side of life.
Yeah, great question. So, a trauma surgeon is someone who has completed a general surgery residency program and does operations on people who are injured. We get additional training in trauma and critical care actually in the United States. So, we're both board certified in general surgery and intensive care. And what we do is we both manage when patients arrive to a hospital who are injured, we manage all of their care. And in addition to that, if they require an operation that pretty much is from the neck down, we do it. So if that means they have an injury in their chest, we would take care of it. An injury in their abdomen, we would take care of it. And then because we're ICU trained, we get to manage them afterwards. So we have really a phenomenal job. Although we deal a lot with people who don't survive injuries, most of us are drawn to this field by this opportunity to really help people at this worst time of their life. And it is an extraordinary privilege to be placed in a situation where every time you come to work, you potentially are making the difference in someone's life, from them living and not living and returning back to their life and prospering. And many of our patients, thankfully, with the modern advances that have occurred in trauma care, really can do quite well. So it's a really extraordinary field to be a part of.
I mean, obviously, it's a pretty broad field too, then, isn't it?
Yes.
But in terms of the sort of, if you like, those heightened disasters and crises, what are the sort of areas that you find yourself being sort of drawn into? What are these incidents and events that you have to work around?
So a lot of the care that we provide now has to do with motor vehicle collisions, motorbike collisions, people who are crossing the street and are unfortunately injured by a vehicle. That's a fairly common thing in cities. We actually also deal with a lot of elderly patients who fall and get hurt as they get more frail as they age. That's really as the population has aged. Certainly in the United States, that's a more and more common thing we take care of. And then every once in a while, we find ourselves responding to larger scale events, mass shootings, unfortunately, multiple vehicle collisions where there's a number of people injured. And then every once in a while, you'll have some rare event for us in an individual center where you have a bus crash or something like that. But unfortunately, part of our job in this day and age is responding to everyday violence in America. And so we take care of a fair number of people who suffer from the results of a violent event, whether that be a stabbing or a shooting or an assault of some type.
Rachel, we are here because of the significant work that you've done on the Asiana plane crash, and I wanted to talk to you again because you've spoken to some of our audiences before at our Resilience Leaders Week, and I was so grateful for you to come. And I remember you saying that in 8 years, no one has really asked you to talk about your experience. And I think that, the reason for this podcast is really to share experiences, share lessons that are sort of retiring as we go along, or are not being passed on to people who really, really need to learn these lessons, because these incidents, however they still occur, they are rare, and it is very hard to find people with your experience. So just for the audience, we're talking about Asiana Flight 214 that traveled from Seoul to San Francisco. There was 307 people on board. Three of them, unfortunately, got killed or died, and 187 of the occupants were injured, but 49 of them very seriously. And they ended up in your care. And I'd love you to just start by telling us what you did, what your role was, and how the day unfolded, and see where the conversation takes us.
Yeah, so it's very interesting. You are correct. Very few people have asked me much about this after about a 3-year time period. So, for the first 3 years after the event, lots of people wanted to talk about it. And then almost no one's talked about it in the 8 to 9 years since. It was a very interesting time in America in our training programs. They all start their training at the beginning of July, and this happened on July 6th. So, for some of the people who responded to this disaster, they had just finished medical school a few months prior, and this was their first week of work as a doctor. And so we had some inexperienced people. So it had been a very busy week and a very challenging week for us preceding this. We had used and depleted our blood bank for other cases unrelated to this, and we're restocking. So it was a really challenging time. And I happen to be what we call the surgeon of the week. So, in many trauma centers around the world, and certainly here in America, we tend to work a week of days in a row and then have different colleagues who cover at nighttime for us. I happen to be that surgeon of the week, which means I was responsible for the care of the patients, both coming in as new patients as well as those who were still in the hospital. On the morning of the plane crash, we had 52 patients already on our service who we were taking care of. That's a sizable service for us at that time, at that particular facility I was working at, and is sort of typical of what we see in the summertime. We had also already had patients in the operating room for other unrelated traumas at the time the plane crashed. And I was actually working quietly. One of my colleagues had agreed to cover for me for a couple of hours so I could catch up on some of my charting and things like that. And I remember I had my pager on, and we get page notifications of traumas. We don't get a lot of information. And I remember that morning the pager just kept going off, and I thought, wow, we're really busy. I'm just going to stop what I'm doing and go in and take care of stuff. And just as I was packing up my stuff to go into the hospital to help out with unrelated traumas, the page went off and it said MCI. About simultaneous with that, I got a text from my husband, who is also a physician, but not in trauma. And he was at home and he said, plane crash at SFO.
So MCI, mass casualty incident.
Correct.
Okay.
And SFO is the 3 call letters for San Francisco's International Airport. It was at that point that I called to the phones that we carry for trauma, and no one answered the phones. So I only lived about 3 or 4, I was only about 3 or 4 minutes away from the hospital. So I instantaneously just packed up and went into the hospital. And when I got there, it was just before the first group of patients had arrived. And I took over the initial triaging of the patients, organized the team, figured out how we were going to respond to this. And the important thing is we had no idea what was coming. Plane crashes are somewhat abnormal in the sense that there's either no survivors or everyone survives and is pretty okay. It's very rare that you have this mixture of people who have walking wounded injuries, meaning they can extract themselves from a scene and seek care, maybe have a broken arm or something like that, and critically injured patients, and so many of them. That's very atypical. So I started out taking care of everyone right as they started arriving.
I remember hearing somewhere that if there is one fatality on an aircraft, you can be sure that the injuries are quite significant. And can you just talk more about what kind of injuries or what you know about injuries on an, in an air accident?
Yeah. So at the time when this all occurred and I was on my way to the hospital, I started thinking in my head really quickly the script, like, what do I know about plane crashes? What have I ever learned? What do I have to think about? Um, and to be honest, I had had no training at dealing with trauma from a plane crash. It wasn't something that I had researched. It wasn't something I knew a lot about. But this is sort of serendipitous, and this will come up later. I had been a chemistry undergraduate major, so I got a chemistry degree in college, and I remembered learning about jet fuel. So when I was driving into the hospital, I was thinking, okay, there might be fuel, there might be exposure, toxins, things we need to think about, and it was sort of in the back of my mind. But when this was all done and I had an opportunity to go and look up what else had been written about plane disasters, it was striking that the things that people talked about was a pretty characteristic injury pattern for people who survived. So a lot of the people who survived would have either spine fractures or long bone fractures, so a leg fracture, arm fracture. Inside their belly would injure organs, which makes sense because these are high impact injuries, and then a fair number of traumatic brain injuries. Chest trauma, breaking ribs and things like that, a little less common, but certainly depending upon where people are in the plane, they can end up with fracturing their breastbone and some of the ribs right there from the impact. So the seatbelts are important because they restrain people and save lives, but the downstream of that is when you're stopping really fast, bones break.
Mhm.
I saw, Rachel, in terms of numbers, I think it was 187 injured. Now,
Correct.
what does that mean to you as a trauma surgeon? How many of those are the ones that you ended up having to, you and your team, to look after?
Yeah. So we ended up getting about 62 to 63 of those patients initially. And then a few people who said they weren't injured at the scene strolled in over the next day and a half, actually. So we ultimately ended up caring for 67 of them. We are the only what we call level one trauma center. That's how trauma centers are rated in the United States for qualification. Level one is the highest. That designation comes from our national governing body called the American College of Surgeons here, and the Committee on Trauma, and where I actually am a central COT member on that national committee. We determine designations and evaluate hospitals. In events like this, in urban areas where there is some type of pre-planning, disaster planning, the patients who are the most injured get taken to those level one trauma centers, and the patients who are believed to be less injured get taken to other centers because no individual center can absorb 187 patients all at the same time. Where I currently work, we're considered an extraordinarily busy trauma center in the United States, and we will see on average somewhere between 25 to 35 new patients that are trauma patients every day that my team has to take care of. So you can imagine that's over a 24-hour period of time. We saw these initial 63 patients over about an hour and a half time period.
Yeah.
So it's more than triple the daily volume in a very compressed time frame.
I mean, I don't know quite how to phrase this, and it depends a lot on the nature of the accident and the crash. But I mean, many might say there were three fatalities, three people died, three out of more than 300 sounds pretty amazing to me.
Mhm.
You're looking after 60 or 70 or so, but one died in your care. I think that's right, isn't it? And I just wondered if you flip it for a moment, rather than looking at the trauma for the families and the victims, What is that like for you?
When patients come in, there are a certain number of patients who you don't actually think are going to survive. And we, because we are well trained, we're trained to figure out who those people are. And when we get triage in a big scenario like this with lots of victims, we are taught to determine who's expectant or put in the black tag category, which means we provide
Sorry, was that black tag?
black tag. And that color scheme is part of a triage algorithm that is used worldwide. And what that means is no matter what you invest in trying to save that person from their injuries, the injuries are so catastrophic they won't survive. And by spending an enormous amount of resources on the individual patient, you may actually harm the other patients because you've diverted resources from people who, with those other resources, may be more likely to survive. So people talk a lot about it when we're training in disasters, but in our everyday lives, our job is to try to save people. And that's a switch of a mindset when you respond to a disaster where you have to make a decision. I'm not going to provide other than comfort, pain medication, and make people comfortable. That's a very significant switch in the mentality versus when we take care of patients on a daily basis. So that's hard. And what becomes harder, which is the case of this, which there's a reason I'm telling this background, um, becomes harder is because none of these patients who made it to our hospital were in that expectant category initially. We went into our normal routines, except heightened, of our team doing everything we could to save someone who it was pretty clear early on had catastrophic injuries they would not survive. But people always talk about when you hear about various different types of disasters, you hear the medical personnel get on TV and talk about how everyone who came to their hospital survives. And we had to get on TV and say someone did not survive, which immediately creates a enormous sense of sadness that's beyond just the sadness that already existed for the tragedy, and that's really hard on the providers. I was the one who delivered information to the family of that patient to tell them that she was not going to survive, and that is a moment that I will never forget. And I do this on a regular basis because of being a trauma surgeon. There are just patients who come to us who just won't survive their injuries no matter what we do. It's the hard part about this job, but that particular event, I remember very clearly coming out of a conference with her parents, and everyone's faces in the hallway. There were more people than there usually are because there had been so much invested in this. Every single person was very emotional, and you could see the devastation on people's face because when you are put into a crisis situation like this, all you can focus on and think about is I'm going to help all these people and I'm going to make them better. But sometimes that's not reality. And so we worry a lot about, in big events, there's been a fair amount written about people having acute stress responses to those events because of probably the heightened attention to it. But as trauma surgeons in general and people who respond to emergencies, there's a lot of talk about the repeated sort of micro exposure to these traumatic events and how that impacts people. So we did a lot of debriefing. We did a lot of formal debriefing, provided a lot of counseling opportunities to our teams, and I think that's really the message. Like it's really important to understand that your caregivers, a broad term, it can be anyone involved in this, really have to have an opportunity to debrief about their experience.
I find in the work that we do, and I always say we're not in the life saving business. I mean, I just, I'm so in awe of what you do day to day, let alone talking about this specific traumatic event. But I always find that. And we advise our clients who manage situations like this also from the company's perspective, dealing with the families, dealing with the patients, dealing with the data, the communications of it all, is that the support that you can get from your own communities, your own families, is almost where you need to go for that. Of course, you need, the
Yeah.
professional support around that too. But I want to talk more about what that team looked like and felt like
Yeah.
before the accident versus after.
Yeah. So, our team has someone like myself. Typically, this is a typical structure of a team. The trauma surgeon, who's the attending surgeon, that's our name here. So we're the leader of the team. We're the experienced trauma surgeon. Then we typically have a number of surgery residents who are physicians already, but training to be surgeons at various different levels. So it can be those surgeons who are just starting out, like we had, all the way to those who are nearing completion of their training after 5 to 7 years, depending upon the track they're in. That team usually has somewhere between 4 to 10 people on it. It just depends on the size of the facility and what's going on. Then we also have advanced practice provider nurses here in the United States and physician assistants. And we usually have some of those on our team, and they also provide care. Uh, and then there are all the other parts of the team. So I can't operate on a patient alone. So I need the operating room personnel, the anesthesiologist. When the patients come in, the emergency medicine physicians play an important role as well. Our orthopedic surgeons who deal with the bone injuries, our neurosurgeons who deal with the traumatic brain injury. On this particular day, we had our sort of normal structure of team, and each of those groups had their own personnel. But very quickly after notification of this, we started to get people that just automatically started arriving at the hospital who heard about this, largely on social media, to be honest, before it hit mainstream media. And they came and we organized those teams. And so we were able to create a lot of mini teams that could take care of the patients and really helped us to be able to provide that care.
And I suppose the camaraderie between you must be significant after this event.
Well, at the hospital that I was working at the time, it's a relatively modest sized hospital. And so the staff that deal with trauma patients was relatively small in the sense that we all knew each other really well, including all the way from the emergency medicine providers to the radiologist, et cetera. So we already knew each other really well. And maybe that's an important lesson that I actually hadn't reflected on until quite recently. That part of the reason we were able to take care of these patients, I think, so successfully and have that instantaneous team dynamic is it's something that we practice on a daily basis because we are at familiarity with one another. We use the same exact skills that we use every day together as teams. And so we, by the nature, were theoretically an already highly functioning team responding to a crisis versus people who don't know each other at all who need to respond. So that idea of practicing, drilling, being prepared, knowing what the disaster plans are, I think are really important in how you would respond to this. Every hospital in America, I don't know worldwide, but every hospital in America is required to have a disaster plan to respond to large scale exercises or large scale disasters like this. And they exercise that plan, but literally, like they get out the plan in notebooks once a year and open it up and dust it off and read through it. But if you close that on any given day, people don't necessarily know what they're supposed to do. And so getting people to understand, when do you come to the hospital if you're not on call when there's a disaster, right? You can't have all your people come because these disasters go on for a long period of time. All the attention's focused on the first few hours, but the first patient came on July 6th and the last patient left on at the end of October. So we were caring for these patients for months.
Yeah.
There's still an element, it sounds, Rachel, of we'll deal with it when it happens,
Yep.
perhaps, rather than actually drawing on the experiences. I mean, obviously, this particular incident we're talking about almost forged the direction of your career. I think it wouldn't be an overstatement, would it? But
Yep.
yet you still get this sense that there's a lack of real appreciation as to how significant this part of the business is.
Yeah, I think we do really well on a daily basis with the sort of mini disasters that occur. The 3 to 5 patients injured simultaneously. Every trauma center in America and probably worldwide can deal with that, no problem. But when you start to get into the numbers of 20 patients at one time, 30 patients at one time, 50 patients at one time, those systems that are designed to take care of 3 to 5 patients start to break down. And commonly, the first thing is communication. And so it is true. We do train for this, but it's hard to simulate and train in real life for something that involves so many patients. So those of us who are in this field, we share experience. We try to talk about it as much as we can. We have disaster courses now that we put people through, but it is still no substitute for having been there. And although we wouldn't wish anyone to ever have to use this skill set, the reality is that it's becoming more common to have to do it. So for me, in the direction of my career, it made me much more focused on understanding the science behind disasters. What could we learn? What could we share with other people that would be not voyeuristic? So, not the exciting part of the disaster, but the nuts and bolts of what it takes to do this and do it well. And then be able to make sure that the people around me who I'm responsible for training, if they ever find themselves in these situations, they have all the tools and the training that they need to respond to maximize the likelihood that the most patients possible can survive.
I suppose having the right systems and processes and training in place is not something that you want to look at in hindsight. If only we did this, if only we had that training, if only, that's something that is so easily fixed. I mean, the chances of it happening is quite low, but the impact is so significant, not only for people working with the patients, caring for the patients, but also the families and, of course, the patients. So you want to have that. You want to have that right, and as you put yourself in a position to be able to respond well, and the only way to do that is to practice, to simulate, to work as teams, to figure it out beforehand, even if it's
Yeah.
not a full scale event.
Yeah. Subsequent to this event, because of my involvement in it, I got to participate in a fair number of training exercises here in the United States on both a local, national, federal level. And those were really important opportunities to really, so to speak, up the game of everybody, to really use a real life example to say, okay, this actually happened, and here's what we did well, here's what we could have done better, to really facilitate those exercises that people go through to maintain skill set in this area. But there are some analogies to sort of everyday life for a trauma surgeon. We always are looking at scenarios and trying to judge who is the sickest and needs the most immediate thing. And the thing that's somewhat unique about trauma surgery is that when my patients arrive, oftentimes patients can't tell me who they are, what their medical problems are because they're too ill. There's no family because we haven't figured out who their family is yet. And so I'm always making decisions that are based upon incomplete information, which for most physicians is incredibly anxiety producing, but we train to do that as trauma surgeons. And so when you respond as a trauma surgeon to one of these disasters, there is a familiarity with it. But what you notice is all the people who are not emergency medicine providers or trauma surgeons, they aren't as prepared. And so in some ways, they can't give us even the small amount of information that we need because the event itself is so distracting because there's so much going on simultaneous. And that's the part that needs the tweaking and the work and the drilling and the education. The medical care part of it, for me as a surgeon, if I'm in the operating room, I have other people worrying about the other 62 people. My job's to worry about that one person in front of me. That's no different than any other day. But it's all the other circumstances around providing the care to these folks that become really important and are often missing from people's planning and disaster plans.
Rachel, from the victim accounting side of things, it was interesting that you said people they can't tell you their name, they don't have ID on them, you don't know who their families are. This is where our clients come into play because they may, while you are taking care of the family, they may be working really hard to find out who. While you look after the patient, they may be working very hard to find out, who are the families or the friends of these patients. But can you tell me a little bit more on how long or the process or who do you rely on to give you that information. Who is this person that you're working with, and who are their families?
Yeah, so we rely a lot on our social work team and our administrative teams who interface with the law enforcement personnel. In this particular case, it would have been interfacing with our sort of airline officials. So in the United States, because this crash occurred in an airport environment and not, say, out in a field or something like that, that was technically a secured environment under the direction of federal authorities in the United States. So nobody could self-extract themselves from the scene. They had to be transported out of an active runway of an airport. So, because of that, the way that the patients arrived and the information we got was very dependent upon information coming from the scene, which was being filtered to us either through the medical personnel who routinely respond and are based at the airport, or from airline officials who at one point produced a manifesto of the plane. We knew exactly who was sitting where in the plane. This is actually fairly interesting. Obviously, they know who's assigned to what seat. This
Yeah.
is why they tell people not to change seats. And some of the patients could tell us what seat they were in. So, by process of elimination, we would feed that back to the airport officials, and they could account for all the patients based upon what seat number they were in. But the
That's a
ones,
process.
yep, it was a process. The ones who were unable to talk to us obviously couldn't tell us where they were seated. And so we just took care of them until they could be identified. And the identification part of it really had to come from the airline because they knew who was on the plane. That was hard for some of the sickest patients because, unfortunately, some of the sickest patients were actually airline employees. So they were the flight attendants who were on the plane. They're all dressed the same. So, right, all the flight attendants wear the same uniform. So, some of the identifications could happen because family members could tell the airline what their family member had been wearing when they got on the plane. But for the flight attendants who were super ill, their uniforms are the same.
Yeah. That's
And
really interesting for me to hear that what they were wearing was so important, because when we talk about identification, we usually talk about formal identification of
right,
deceased, where DNA may come to play and things like
right,
that. But identifying the living, it's a different process, isn't it? It's
it is
different information that we can draw on, to be
correct.
able to try and, she's male or he's male, this is his age, this is what he was wearing, so
Correct.
there's a lot of that you can rely on.
Right.
That's very interesting for me to learn.
And obviously, you all know the airline industry better than me, but at the time when this event occurred, this particular group of flight attendants were all the same, relatively the same height, relatively the same build, wearing the same uniforms from the same ethnic backgrounds. So identification was significantly delayed. So we didn't have anybody to talk to for a while for some of the patients. And then over the course of many days, the families arrived, and the families were always brought by the airline, escorted by airline personnel to have these really challenging conversations with us. So it was a very different than what we're used to. We're used to interfacing with next of kin who are identified by either law enforcement or social workers. We have a pretty good identification of who the patient is before we ever bring a family in to see a patient. When we brought the families in, we were like, we think this person is this person based upon their photo ID, but we didn't actually know. And unfortunately, some of the patients were disfigured from the injuries. And so that made it also challenging. So
I mean,
very,
you
very unique.
yeah, but and that's the thing. Every case is unique. There, it's all about individuals, isn't it? In this sort of big mass picture. As it happens, you're a leading expert in AI, Rachel, in this area. How? I mean, it's a little bit of a tangent given where we've been
Yeah.
talking, but how can AI be applied then, perhaps even in these areas of whether it's from identification or perhaps more the trauma surgery? How do you
Yeah.
see the new world? What's it going to look like?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I think the biggest place where AI plays a role potentially in disasters, and we've done some of this work subsequently and written about it, and others have now as well, is actually in identifying in some of these events the location of individuals. So, using geolocation, if people have geolocation turned on their cell phones, we can actually identify where people are. It's almost like having a beacon on you. And so if someone is trapped somewhere and they say, I'm still in the plane, as an example, someone could get a beacon and know that that's where they are. And so we can do that. So there's sort of that aspect of disaster. The other aspect of disaster is helping us understand quicker the size of a disaster. So we did some very interesting work using social media signatures. When one of the social media platforms, the data was public. Now it's harder to get the data, but when it was public, we were able to look and see that the public dissemination of information using social media is so rapid that it precedes disaster signals often that are formal disaster signals to tell us to ramp up. And to be quite honest, the vast majority of us had the most of the information we had initially in the first 20 to 40 minutes of the disaster, which were a critical preparation period for us, came from social media. So the first official notification to us was there was a plane crash at SFO. At first, someone told us it was a cargo plane, which clearly was not true, right? If it's a cargo plane, we know how many people are on a cargo plane, not many. Then it was a small regional jet. Then it was, no, it's a large international flight, but it took time for that to get to us. But the first tweet from the airport from somebody, when it was Twitter at the time, they were called tweets, 30 seconds after the plane crashed, there was a photo of it. And I happened to pull up social media and could see a few photos really quickly when before we got the first patient, and I was like, oh no, this is not a cargo plane, this is a very large plane. And so the ability to build signatures and signals like that can glean non-traditional information from social media signatures gives us ample preparation time to help us. So that's a place where it's used. And then for identification, there's a lot of you guys have all heard and seen at this point. There's very few people who haven't at this point. Computers, we can teach them to recognize a cat versus a dog. And so that's caused an entire, it's a very simplistic model, but that's caused an entire growth in the field of something called computer vision, which is essentially teaching a computer to understand a photo and see the photo it's seeing. And so that's how a lot of facial recognition technology works now. So if the airline companies had archived photos of the employees, or now with the way that security is done in many places in the world, we don't retain the photos, so to speak, but there are ways to get people's passport photos, right, instantaneously from federal officials in the countries that they're coming from. We could have done photo recognition with patients to identify them quicker.
Wow.
That's fascinating.
Um,
That's the sort of, yeah, sorry, Anne-Marie, the sort of development that you can see real progress. I mean, one of the things that fascinated me, and I don't want to dwell on it, but you said, you haven't really spoken much about some of these learnings and experiences over recent years, because I guess partly from a media perspective, we are obviously focused on a disaster or a crash and the immediate aftermath. But we're not particularly bothered about the heroes who've saved lives and have put in the graft, if you like, even immediately afterwards, let alone on a longer term basis. So, is that something you think that, in a media sense, we are missing, or is it more as almost an industry and sector sense that these lessons aren't necessarily being passed on?
Yeah, I think you are correct. Media, your area of expertise, not mine, moves very quickly, right? So the thing that's the lead story within a couple hours isn't the lead story anymore. And I think historically, when these events occurred, they had a little bit more staying power in terms of media because we didn't have so much instantaneous news all the time. And now there's this pressure to always have the next news story. And the public likes both tragedy and feel good story, right? So they like to hear that people did really well, and they, are drawn to tragedy to want to get as much information as they can. I think for those of us who do this, we're so laser focused at the time on taking care of the patients that we aren't engaged in the same way with the media. Usually, our part of any press conference about any disaster is very narrow and small, and it's all about the facts, understandably so. But we also are all very cognizant of fiercely protecting the privacy of the patients. And so I think that combination of all of those factors means that in many ways, those of us who provide the immediate life saving care once they reach the hospital, we exist very much in the background. And we're comfortable being in the background. But the downside of that is that the lessons don't get disseminated widely outside of your immediate sphere. So if I go to any trauma surgeon and talk about disaster, they understand what the issues are. But that's our immediate peer group. Once you start to spread out from that peer group, those lessons, if we don't keep talking about them, they are lost. And we continually are relearning them with every event.
Mhm. Yeah. One of the lessons that I've learned in my career came from you, Rachel. And I sort of want to explain how our paths crossed, me being a little bit of an investigator trying to track you down. But um, I've done a bit of my own research and, in my career about, where can we do better? What can we do more? Where are the gaps? And I found a YouTube video of you talking about the Asiana crash. And I was in absolute awe with what you were saying in that YouTube video. And then I tried to track you down to go, the companies, the airlines, our clients, our industry need to listen to this. Because we've looked at everything, everything around, but there was this glaring sort of slice in the pizza of what we do in emergency response from a airline's perspective that just was missing, and that was the looking after the injured survivors. And there was something that you said, and I want to leave you to tell the story about how the families did not know what was waiting for them in San Francisco. And I think that that's where it made me realize we need to fill this gap in taking care of the families. But tell me more about what happened there and what we can learn from that.
I think one of the things that's unique about international travel now is that it's so easy for you to travel to an environment where you have no connection to it. You don't speak the language, you don't know anybody there, and that's fantastic, right? We have worldwide travel and tourism. But when an event happens in a place that's not your comfort zone, your home territory, so to speak, your culture, there are all of these very unique aspects to responding to disaster that make it really challenging for the families and also challenging for the healthcare providers. In this particular case, all the communication with the families until they were physically on site with us at the hospital was done through the airline and was reliant upon the airline providing very forthcoming information. So we felt like we had delivered very clear information about the status of the patients. This person's in critical condition, this one's in serious condition, this one's in good condition, and information about why it was so important for us to be able to speak to some of the families as quickly as possible. Initially on, the airline also provided their own interpreter services because the patients were most of them were non-English speaking, I think the airline saw that as a comfort to the families to be able to provide that resource. Totally makes sense, but those interpreters were not interpreters who had medical training. So, in a healthcare system in the United States, our interpreters are required to have some baseline medical knowledge because they're translating medical words and medical concepts. The translators provided to the families by the airline had none of that. And so, when we would deliver information and then they would interpret the information for the families before they arrived, they would use understandably so, their own cultural interpretation of what we were saying. So when the families came, many of them thought that they were coming to pick someone up to just escort them back home to their home country, and that they would just like arrive and the person would be fine and they could leave right away. And it became very clear to me in the first conversation that they had no idea what they were actually coming to. And here I am sitting down telling them, your loved one is in critical condition, explaining what that meant, and telling them that there was risk of them not surviving was completely traumatizing to them because they literally thought they were coming to just escort their loved one home. Obviously, I don't know what was said to them before they got there, but it was very clear to us that they certainly did not comprehend what they were coming into. And although so there was only one person who passed away in our hospital, we had many other people who were critically injured and were at risk of dying. Fortunately, did not.
Yeah. And I think that's probably where that was for me from the work that we do in liaising with families, liaising with hospitals, that I think we could do better, and to learn from that. So I think that what we provide now, the injured survivor support, the link that I missed, the slice that I said was missing, was that communication with the family, preparing them to the to the long term effect that this has on them, but also that they may have to go to the hospital and stay there for a long time because, as you mentioned, some of
Right.
these patients were there for a long, long time. It
Correct.
is. It wasn't, you're going to be in hospital for a week and then come home. It was a complete different situation with life-changing injuries.
Yeah, and even the ones who weren't fatal, they didn't have near fatal injuries or life-threatening injuries. They had injuries that made it such that international travel back home wasn't realistic for a given period of time. So even in the ones who we weren't delivering, terrible news to, life-altering news, there was still an expectation that I can't believe, why did no one tell me? And that was really hard for us because here we're trying to build an immediate trust with a family through a language barrier in a different country that culturally the medical world functions differently. And um, and they were immediately put almost in a distrusting environment of us because it felt like, why did no one tell us? But we weren't a part of that communication stream. So that was, I think, really a clear opportunity for everyone to think differently about how we tell people information. And I don't think you have to tell them the terrible details, but in retrospect, it really would have been very beneficial for us to have had a video conference with those families before they arrived or some facilitated communication so that they had a moment to prepare for what they were going to walk into.
Yeah.
We falsely made the assumption on our side that they already knew. And so when we started going through our normal, these are their injuries, and you could just see how overwhelmed the families were. Most of those conversations were with families where the patients didn't have a singular injury. They had many injuries as a result of the impact of the accident. So there was a lot of information to communicate. And I would say for me personally, that was a really interesting learning experience because it has definitely influenced the way that I talk to patients' families now. And I modulate how much initial information I give them in that first conversation when I walk out of the operating room, having just tried to save their loved one's life. I tell them the key things they need to know and then always preface it with, we'll talk about the other injuries later. This is what you need to know in this moment because it's too much, too soon, too quick for people.
Yeah, it's communication. I mean, it's everything in many ways, isn't it? Communicate, communicate, communicate. Talking of which, Elmarie, I've just clocked that Rachel is joining us from California, which means it's coming up to 20 to 5 in the morning. So either you're finishing a night shift, Rachel, or it's probably time we let you get some shut eye. But I,
I'm I'm actually, this is like my normal time. I get up pretty early. So um we actually are used to being up all night for the trauma surgeons. Can I add one more thing that I think is really important for the airline? before
Yeah.
we part
Please,
ways.
please, you've got us. You've got our time. You can carry on. We are here to learn. So please
So
do.
the information about the communication with the families was an important learning point. But we were also completely in the dark about factual information from the scene that could have impacted the way we provided care to the patients. So we had to make a lot of assumptions in what we were caring for. So if you look at pictures of the plane, there's one that I shared in some of my talks. There is clearly a fire in the plane, and there's black smoke and white smoke, which means there are different chemical things burning in the environment that people were exposed to. Nobody told us there was a fire on the plane. So, had we known there was a fire on the plane, we would have decontaminated all the patients right away. We would have thought about decontamination. We serendipitously, some of the patients that I was primarily responsible for, I decontaminated them, but other people didn't think about it, right? Because normally in contamination situations, we know that information coming in from the field and we have processes around them. So we didn't know there was.
What does decontamination mean in the sense of a patient?
Yeah,
Is it
so
cleaning
most of the
them
patients who
or?
came had debris all over them. So if you look at pictures of the inside of the plane, there is the plane structure is a remarkable engineering feat, right? The plane structure itself was relatively intact. But inside, you see all kinds of things that become aerosolized. People breathe that in, even if it's not smoke. That can cause changes in vital signs, blood pressure, your electrolytes in your body that we have to replace, those kinds of things that are medically important for us, but historically have been completely firewalled from the medical teams receiving the information. The information we get from the scene is this is how many patients, this is how many people we think are being transported. That's about it. So we don't get all those other critical pieces of information. So decontamination is we scrub those people down and get that stuff off of them as quickly as possible. If it's stuff that they could have potentially inhaled, we check different things in the blood that we might not have thought about checking until they develop a cardiac arrhythmia because their calcium levels are really low. Things like that are critically important for their medical care. We never received any of that information. And when we started to see some manifestations of some weird things, probably because of my chemistry background, I instantaneously was like, oh, this is hydrocarbons or other things people were exposed to that are in jet fuel. We should think about these things, that we started being able to proactively treat it. But that came from within our own team, Googling things, looking stuff up quickly on the fly, seeing patterns between the patients. We actually depleted the entire hospital of its calcium, IV calcium stores, because we kept having to give so much calcium to patients. That's really hard to do. We got plenty of that. We had to get it from another hospital because something that some of the patients were exposed to led to low calcium levels at like indetectable levels, which has a lot of potential problems with it. When we called back to the field and we asked, what's in the field? People are like, I don't know. And then someone said, well, we sprayed foam when the plane was on fire. And we're like, well, what's in the foam? Well, it turns out there's lots of different things that are in the foam and nobody could tell us in real time. So there are all of these airline specific response items which have traditionally not been shared with the medical teams responding. Outside of that team that immediately comes, they promise you the firefighters who arrive to do this, they're well versed in this, but we never thought about it. And then when we did think about it, and fortunately we thought about it pretty quickly within a few minutes of seeing these patients because something seemed odd. So it wasn't a long delay. We then had a really hard time ascertaining the information of what it is we might be dealing with.
So interestingly, you need a checklist to go, this is the information that I need from the airline. Like
Yeah,
what is on board, what's burning on board. This
correct.
is the information that I need from emergency service, the fire
Correct.
brigade. What are they spraying? What's in that? And how does that affect my patient
And
coming through the door?
yeah, and
And my
some
staff, because
contaminants
they're
that are
facing their own protection too, yeah.
Yeah, some of the contaminants that are also on people's skin can actually make the provider, us as the doctors and nurses touching them, we can get it onto our skin and we can also get sick, theoretically.
Yeah.
It's not been described before, theoretically. And so there's a patient and provider safety component to this that's never included in anybody's disaster plan.
And that is so unique to
Yeah.
specific disasters, isn't it? To different kinds of disasters.
And I imagine it's
Um,
probably unique to individual planes, with the sense of planes that are different manufacturers use different materials, different fire departments have different foam, like there's all of these sort of localized, unique aspects to it. But it struck me like, why can no one produce a list for me of what might be on a plane?
Yeah, and you
that's
think
interesting.
gathering that data now is doable.
It's
It takes
completely
a huge
doable.
amount of data, but it's doable. Yeah.
Right. You may never know where
Yeah.
one of these planes is going to ultimately end up, which is some of the risk associated with it. But there are things that can be known up front. And, as a researcher, if I'm using chemicals in my lab, at least in the United States, I have to have a label on it that tells me everything about it so that if there's a spill of that chemical, we know exactly what's in it. That's a requirement. I'm sure somewhere this information existed. It just wasn't readily available to us. And I'm sure that no one thought that it was critical information for us to have.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's maybe where the manufacturer comes in of all the, the different components.
Correct.
It becomes a slight minefield, so to speak, because this information is there, the likelihood of you needing it is exceptionally low, but the value of having it can make such a life-saving difference.
Yeah. I
It's
think that's
finding that balance in between. Like,
yeah,
why do you need it? You'll never need it, but
right.
when you need it, it's significant. Yeah, that's fascinating.
Correct. And it makes the
Um,
difference. Like we could have had more deaths had we not recognized really quickly that there was some chemical exposure abnormality that potentially was harming the patients. And the thing is, we could never prove what it was because it's hard to test for these things you don't know. We just know we had to give an abnormal amount of electrolytes back to people to normalize them. And that's sort of pathognomonic for some exposure risk.
that's fascinating.
Rachel, um, Rachel, you bring a sort of sense of urgency to
Hmm.
this whole debate about, I mean, disaster response. Goodness, there have been enough disasters, and of course, the sophistication has grown, the modernization has
Yeah.
grown, and yet it's clear that there are so many areas where so much improvement could still be made. And I think it feels slightly mind blowing that you haven't had much chance to talk over the last 8 years about these sorts of areas. So it's an absolute privilege to have you on. Thank you very
Well,
much.
thank you so much for the opportunity. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Rachel. Lovely to see you again, and thanks for
You
sharing
too.
your knowledge and your experience with us. Really appreciate that. Thanks for that, David. I'm so glad that Rachel could join us. Like I mentioned to you before, it took me a while to track her down. And since I've heard her speak so many years ago, it was so important that we pin her down to get this message out there and the lessons learned.
Oh, it's time well spent tracking her down, absolutely. And I tell you what I found fascinating, Elmarie, was the way she was talking about the lack of information even today that comes through from the disaster response to them in surgery. It was almost, well, we know there are 30 people coming and they'll be with us in 10 minutes. Beyond that, it's up to us. And she could see all the areas where that could be improved. And I would guess relatively simply. I thought that was extraordinary. Those sort of improvements are there to be had.
Absolutely. For me, it was the victim accounting, what happens on the hospital side, and it just shows this coordinated effort from the airline, emergency services, and the hospital to be able to find out who is in their care and how to reach out to their families and to have that communication with the families around the status of the patient.
Yeah, and to top it all, she's an expert in AI, which is hugely annoying that you can be
Beauty.
two experts in
Yeah,
one like that, and a very articulate person to go with it.
exactly.
But great guess, well tracked down. I think that was well worth it. It brings us to the end of the Go Crisis podcast for this episode, but of course the next one is coming hard on its heels. So keep an eye out, and for now, stay well. Bye
Bye
bye.
bye.